Hey guys, I'm Matt Lighty, and this is a video that is quickly talking about basically my remaining questions, or the things I have the biggest questions slash concerns with regarding patch 3.25. This patch is extensive. They kind of hawked this as being a very large patch notes, being roughly 30,000 words. That being said, you know, a lot of this is like kind of stat padded words, so it's not as drastic as it seems, although in general, this is the biggest patch probably in the history of the game, at least in the past 5 years. It's like 9 months of content in what is intended to be a 3-month league, which I imagine is probably going to be like a 4 to 6 month league. I'm pretty sure this league is going to be extended, but either way, that's neither here nor there. I'm not going to go over everything in patch notes. I'll be here for 2 hours if I was. There's just a couple things I have questions about because it's very confusing. So there is, how do I show this really? So it's physical taken as damage. So there's a couple representations of this, which is they're trying to remove from the game. Basically, every single mention of physical damage taken as something else, right? They're basically trying to remove from the game. They don't want us to be able to take physical damage as elemental damage as easily as we were, so they're removing it. Now, from basically most every representation of it, whether it's the tree or uniques or whatever. However, my concern is this. The biggest three Fizz taken as uniques are Dawnbreaker, Lightning Coil, and Cloak of Flame. All right? Those are the biggest ones. Those are the ones most people use, Cloak of Flame and Lightning Coil, sometimes in conjunction with Dawnbreaker, to mitigate physical damage as elemental. Now, none of those uniques are mentioned in the unique item change. To me, that's concerning, because if they're not nerfed, are they really going to be in the game as the only representations of this type of stat, or is what I think is these things are going to get a massive kick in the nuts for drop rate? Now, currently, Cloak of Flame is a tier 3 unique, which is pretty common, and Lightning Coil is also a tier 3 unique, which is also pretty common. And Dawnbreaker is the 33% drop off of base Exarch, which is very common. Now, my fear is that these things are extremely accessible, can be used in conjunction, shield plus either body armor, and you're mitigating a very large chunk of physical damage as different elemental types of damage. I think these things are either going to get nerfed and they didn't mention it, or they're just going to become more rare. That's my one thought. Because the fact that they didn't mention them at all is a bit suspicious. And last time they didn't mention something kind of like this was Destiny, Defiance of Destiny, and they changed the drop rate to T0 without mentioning it. So that's why I'm like, that's like on the fence about that. All right, cool. Next thing is the problem with Back to Basics. All right, so Back to Basics was completely removed from the Atlas. All right. Totally fine. They think it's too strong. They don't like the playstyle. Remove it. I get it. Whatever. The problem is that the way that Atlas Uber boss fragments drop, so fragments for something like Uber Exarch, right? These fragments, okay, drop off of bosses from 17s, blazing fragments. The only way to scale up the value of these fragments dropping is by increasing base map quantity, which was reduced. And now with Back to Basics not being on the tree, massively reduced in the top end. Like, so rarely would you get 3 fragment drops. Almost always you get 2 fragments, and sometimes you get 1 with a Back to Basics tree. Without Back to Basics and a post-nerf 17, like, you're gonna probably get mostly 1s and 2s for fragments. So, essentially, Uber bossing is gonna be, like, twice as hard to access now, or twice as, you know, long to access. Like, it's going to be twice as inaccessible because we're going to be getting significantly less Uber fragments, which is kind of unfortunate. They didn't mention anything with like the Uber boss fragments at all in the patch notes. So yeah, if there's no change in rate to that, no base change for stuff for 17s, then there's nothing scaling up that value, and then they'll still gonna be dropping 1 to 3, and we'll never, it'll literally be like impossible to reach a 3 fragment drop because we can't actually increase the quant of the map to where it previously could do that without Back to Basics. So curious what that's going to shake out for. The other thing was, so we have another update which I think is good, like a step in the right direction thing, is melee totem skills. They're just basically removed from the game. They didn't like it, so playing a melee build, you walk up and then have to keep a totem up with Panopticon to get a bunch of a buff from that, specifically a ton of damage. They didn't like that meta. However, there are two things I would like to note about this that really make it feel like nothing's changed or it's worse for this. So like it sucked to play a melee build and have to every single pack drop a totem because you'd be like a fool not to damage wise, or like just the benefit of that. However, like this patch, they made it so like looking at like a build from last league, for example, Call to Arms has been removed from the game, and it now doesn't trigger war cries, so you have to manually cast war cries because it actually totally changes what it does. It's a different thing altogether. So there's no longer an automated war cry setup in the same way. It has a reservation cost and it just doesn't function with the base war cry function. It's just a different thing altogether. So that automation has been removed, and you have to either manually cast multiple war cries or then reserve mana, which you wouldn't do. So that's manually casting them. Trigger skills no longer happen. The retaliation skills, which are manually casting now, based off of their different proc chances. So like you block or something like that, then you have to hit a trigger. So you're hitting a war cry manually, you're hitting a trigger manually now. And on top of that, you have banners, right? Which is another thing altogether. So previously banners were effectively an automated aura, and now they're going to be a thing that has no passive effect and only a placed effect, right? So we're only going to be placing banners. And so now when I was previously having to place one button as a melee build, which was the totem, I'm now having to push 3 as I progress through combat, which is a war cry, a banner, and then, just it just feels like a retaliate, and it feels like it's like way more clicking and way more necessary, because it's just the question still remains: would I rather play a melee build and then not have to invest in these things, or rather play a melee build and have to do them? I'm missing a lot by not doing them, so I feel kind of forced to engage with them. Does that make sense? It just feels like it's kind of the same problem, but worse. Now, the top end scenario of having a totem, just to clarify, could have been like 60% more damage. Is the benefit of a war cry always active, a banner active, and having a retaliate skill triggering 60% more damage? I don't know. Probably not. It probably isn't that egregious, right? But also we don't have blessings. Like they removed the blessing on top of that. So the divine blessing has now been torched, and it only exists on March of the Legion, which a lot of builds also triggered blessings every 20 seconds. So a build that was previously triggering maybe 2 to 4 things now lost the extra aura, lost the damage from the totem, which was most likely, to be fair, redirected into the skill, since most melee skills receive 2 to 3 times the damage scaling, although they did lose a lot of the flat for the per scan scaling. Like, it just seems like this is probably the exact same playstyle, but maybe worse, maybe different. I don't know. It's just like a question I have. I'm curious about that interaction, because on paper, the way that this is being described is I'm going to have to now, war cry and banner and retaliate, when previously I just had to totem, or just had a totem plus blessing. Then I do 2 things before, I got to do 3 things now. 3 is bigger than 2 as far as I'm concerned when it comes to pushing buttons. So it's like, that's kind of where my mind is at with that. Aside from that, though, it's like the biggest question of all, my 4, I guess, questions is in regard to item rarity and quantity. Now, this is like impossible to answer. I don't expect an answer. There's no way to really tell what this is like, except for feel, but it's still a question I have, everyone has. This is like a universal question. All quantity on characters have been removed. All right, they've totally restructured how IQ works for basically all monsters in the game, right? So, how is this going to feel? That's the question. Like, everyone who played through Archdem remembers the last time there was a massive rarity quantity shakeup, and it was like we entered like a loot drought. Now, we just came off the back of a couple leagues being Necropolis and Affliction, where it was like super tons of loot everywhere. Like, there was no problem with loot. Currency, fragments, scarabs, out the wazoo. So I'm really curious how this is going to feel. Is it just going to be kind of withdrawal from that? Is it going to be balanced equitably with the mechanic? This is the question I have. Just like, how is this going to feel? Because it's just, this isn't really something that they could, like, this is a totally fine paragraph, and it's represented appropriately. But I don't know how they would ever be able to display this, like, in a numerical form that's, like, digestible. Because really all they'd have to say is, like, everything's going to feel different. Play it, and you'll see, and it probably feels fine. Like, Again, in line with their general philosophy is that killing monsters you get loot, and if they're more difficult, you should get more loot. I 1,000,000,000% agree. Realistically, quantity or rarity shouldn't exist, right? In a nutshell, it should be like you kill harder shit, you kill shit faster, you should get more shit more better. Perfectly fine. So the real question is going to be, and this is like the ultimate question for this entire patch. They've introduced about 200 great ideas, 200 million, you know, great things that they have in mind, but they've added them all at once. This is like the Powerpuff Girls, where they put so many ingredients in the pot, you know, and it's like, how the hell would you even be able to suss out what of all of this is going to be responsible for things feeling good or bad? Like, when you change this many variables at once, how are you supposed to differentiate between what's responsible for positive or negative changes between this billion amounts of changes in standard and in league? Because it's going to be a different dynamic in both. Even more so in trade, because there's an auction house now for currency and stackable things. Anyway, that's my thoughts on this. You know, I don't want to say read the patch notes because you'll be there for 2 hours, but feel free to read through the patch notes or watch the reveal trailer. If you have any questions, ask them specifically. You know, and a PSA, anybody, if you see any videos out there or people talking about anything with any real certainty about anything that was changed, they're probably full of shit, because we have no idea. Like, we don't know how retaliation skills feel. We don't know how item rarity feels. We don't know how extended loot range feels. This is like an example of a league that these are all great things, but until you actually get into it and know how it feels, you have no real idea. There's been no testing, no proving, no nothing. We just have to try. You have to play the game. So anyone saying like, this is the new best build, this is the new whatever, this strategy, they're full of shit, okay? They're just baiting you, all right? So play the league, experience it yourself, make an appropriate reaction, and that's it. If you have any questions, hit me up. I'm Mathew Lighty. Have a good day.